Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from False Noise, Floral Strobe. Okay, so False Noise is the alias for one Evan Holt, currently a mainstay of a little label called Upscale, which some may recognize as the label co-founded by Frequent and Hudson Lee, aiming to create their own path in the world of electronic music, and so far have been pretty dang successful. Some people may remember Hudson Lee's Headspaces as my number 2 album of 2019, and the last pick for the Essential Albums of the Decade video I did with Landon Remixes. And said album happened to also feature 2 tracks with False Noise as a guest producer. Additionally, those 2 tracks, Way of Thought and Lost, were 2 of my easy favorites from that album. I don't think Headspaces would have stuck with me nearly as much without their inclusion. I'll admit I don't know a lot of this guy's solo music outside of that. The only thing I'd heard from him before that was a track called Emerald Green that was pretty dang solid, with some pretty fun, atmospheric, experimental drum and bass type material. Also heard the whole EP of the same title later on, and it turned out to live up to that title track's promise with even more experimentalism spread around. Definitely worth your time as well. I'd also checked out a one-off single he released called Scarlet Red. That was also pretty neat and very much in the same mold as that EP, also worth checking out. But when I heard this guy was going to be putting out his own debut solo album, I thought I should give it a shot. I've enjoyed everything I've actually heard from him so far, and it turns out this album's freaking great! While stylistically it's very much the same kind of stuff he was already doing before, it does all sound a lot like Emerald Green and Scarlet Red and all the other stuff I'd already heard from him. Hearing it all play out in full album form turned out to be just as satisfying as hearing a one-off single or an EP of his stuff. Hell, even more so, because having a full album means more space to change things up and even more sonic variety, and False Noise is up to that challenge, allowing the 10 tracks here to each form their own identity apart from each other, despite all very much flowing together into the same cohesive piece. Taking lots of rougher synth tones you might associate with old, early 2010s electro house maybe, and modern dubstep and that kind of stuff, but presenting them in super wild and experimental ways and completely deconstructing them from the ground up. Tons of glitches and detail all over the place everywhere, and every second has tons of sounds flying at you at high speed. Maybe a little shorter hook sometimes, but this isn't really the kind of album that feels like it'd really need that. And even then, to say that it's completely lacking hooks wouldn't be accurate either. This isn't exactly trying to be Confield. Okay, maybe in some ways it kind of is. At least there's some clear influence there in how absolutely nuts and detail-oriented everything is. But there is still some definite pop appeal hiding under all the layers of glitches and craziness. There's always lots of bright and flashy melodies radiating out of all these dense mixes. And the project certainly never goes as far off the deep end as Outica always do. Whatever the case, I gotta say, this album was really damn good. So, may as well get into individual tracks then. Our intro is Bright Like the Sun, which aims to set the tone, build up the energy, and hype you up for what you're getting into. Lots of harsh and abrasive melodies constantly fading in and cutting out, and eventually paying off into this almost drum and bass beat that feels like it keeps starting and stopping and tripping over itself, but somehow comes together in a coherent pulse, and then going back to the same broken build-ups as before. Definitely feels more like an intro or overture or something in the context of the full project rather than a massively huge standout in its own right, but still definitely does its job well and pulls me in pretty immediately. We then move into the title track, so seamlessly that I often don't even notice it's there at all. Perhaps its tone is more bright and uplifting and optimistic than the opener, though still absolutely pummeling and seeming to change direction every few seconds, with all these airy chords getting stuttered and chopped up into the tiniest of fragments. I suppose this would technically be my pick for least favorite, since it's the one track on here that least stuck out to me by itself. Also, that fake cutoff ending at like 3.5 minutes in throws me off every single time. But this track is still plenty of fun and keeps up the energy we've already established. For me though, the point at which this album crosses over into great is our third track, Collapse Theme. A 7-minute behemoth that just seems to fit in every facet of this album style. Giant flashy chord pads, undulating bass, and like 7 different side tracks into different rhythms and mixes, or Coma Duster-esque glitchy breakdowns, or loud and blaring ambient sections. And somehow this was one of the tracks that has among the most memorable hooks. Often carried by these somewhat understated Japanese sounding vocals, and just as often carried by these very sharp synth leads that can have varying textures depending on where in the track you are. The fact that a track this complex and meandering still has a coherent hook that sticks in my head is always a good sign. From there, the amount of glitchiness and insanity stays roughly the same across the board, but applied to fairly different mixes. Like on Dreamer, which is the most ambient-centric cut in the bunch, staying relatively low-key and peaceful compared to other tracks on here, but still made up of the same kinds of flashy melodic synths that can often get really blown out and intense. Definitely a track I appreciate the inclusion of. And then you get Intertwined Forever, which is one of the poppier tracks in the bunch, with the processed anime vocals taking the lead for much of it and delivering nonsense hooks. For what it's worth, while I can certainly see these vocals being a pretty major turnoff for some people, I wasn't nearly as irritated with them as I might be otherwise. It doesn't feel like cutesiness for its own sake, a la Porter Robinson's Flicker. These vocals and mixes instead hit the same note for me as One of Trick's Point Never's sticky drama. They're so heavily processed and clearly just there to carry the lead melody and not much else. Also, they're not nearly as sharp and overbearing as the vocals on that track either. The whole album, while I'm at it, definitely feels pretty heavily influenced by Garden of Delete, just in general. Though False Noise is still bringing a pretty different interpretation to these kinds of sounds that he can call his own. But anyway, going from there, we get a couple of much more abstract cuts. You got Jewel Crust, which is most exemplified by all its dense layers of all these plinking sounds that sound like you've run through a xylophone through a blender or something, alongside these kind of low-key ambient sections that keep you on the edge of your seat with their dramatic bass washes and forward-reverse triangle sounds. And later some more intense bassier parts with these big synth stabs that almost resemble like 80s guitar power chords or something. That one's really interesting sounding. And you got Bioluminess, another 7-minute track that is most characterized by these big side tracks that sound very mechanical, with all these wubbing sub-basses wavering up and down and being joined by lots of dripping water sounds and collecting noises. The whole mix vaguely reminding me of like a low-key modernized take on the intro to Orbital's 8 Bands. You also got other sections with all these sounds like pouring water down a drain behind a wall and other melodic segments and almost vocals that remain fairly sparse but still pop in and out at high speed. The whole track's one of the most toned down in the bunch, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have time for plenty of fast-paced strangeness all throughout its running time, which quite frankly feels a lot shorter than it actually is. And that transitions right into Sylvan Strobe, another one of the poppier and most straightforward cuts here, with not much to it than a progression of shifting chord pads and buzzing bass. And later on, probably the hardest to ignore Japanese vocal appearance. Still very much processed in sticky drama style again, and still not as in your face as that track, but it's extremely cutesy and anime-ish, and again will likely turn off some people in that way. It still didn't annoy me, though. Like, it is a really quick moment, and this track is one of the easiest to identify from a distance, so I still enjoy it. But now it's finally time to wind down the album, and by wind down I mean deliver two of the most impactful and fun tracks in the bunch. Wing has among the most coherent of drum and bass grooves here, with these plucking chords and an almost pendulum-like drum track running through these bass washes and airy pads in a really awesome and uplifting way. Later with really pummeling sections and some really tranquil ambient moments that later just pick up where the groove left off. That one might even be my favorite in the bunch, though if it is, it's not by much. There's quite a bit of competition, obviously. And finally, we close with Majesty, which starts out really airy and open, but gets swallowed up by intense bass washes and really fast-paced melodic segments, and later what sounds like a J-pop track chopped up into tiny pieces. Also industrial noise buildups with banging kicks, and long breakdowns of glitches too, and even a downward key change at one point. He's making sure we go out on a high note and bringing some of his most fun and complex mixes, and definitely finishes the project on a satisfying note. So yeah, that's Floral Strobe. If I have any complaints with the album as a whole, I suppose the whole thing is mastered in a particularly claustrophobic way. It often feels like all of these sounds are kind of crammed together and never convey a particularly strong sense of space. Even the ambient segments were being built off of some flatter sounding synth textures, which led to this project feeling much smaller scale than it actually is. It might have been nice for some of these tracks to feel like they could soar even more than they do already and allowed the sound design more space to breathe, But honestly, this wasn't such a big problem that it became distracting or took away from the tracks as they were. Whatever the case, this project is absolutely nuts in the best possible way, and I had a ton of fun with it. I think it's really well constructed and paced too. I don't know how well it's going to fare in the coming months replay value-wise, but I've listened to it like 6 times in preparation for this video, and my opinion hasn't really wavered any. It hasn't grown or shrunk on me, and I remain just as impressed by it every time I did put it on. It's definitely going to be a year-end list contender, and I think False Noise has definitely proven himself to be a name worth paying attention to. Not much else to say. Definitely give this thing a shot, and I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me a review, something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.